The Titan X Pascal was the flagship Pascal GPU only a few short years ago. And even though the card has dropped in price since the release of Turing and Ampere, the prices are still higher than similarly spec 1080 Ti's, and not to mention the thing only comes in the Founders Edition flavor. But let's take a look at the card and see how it performs in 2022 despite its aging tech. It may surprise you just how much life this thing has left. Before we get into this video, I'd like to take a moment to say not to forget to leave a like and subscribe, and comment if there's something you think I missed in this video. If there is some information that you feel I should have covered, then commenting or joining the community Discord is one of the best ways to get in touch. Now without any further ado, let's dive into the Titan X Pascal, and see how its specifications translate to real-world performance. For starters, let's take a look at the die and memory system. Launching in August of 2016, this flavor of the 16nm based GP102 die is slightly cut down, coming in with 256 CUDA cores disabled. This brings our shader count up to 3,584 cores built using 12 billion transistors, which if you're familiar with the specifications of the RTX 3060, it sounds similar. Now what's funny is that Pascal is actually stronger than Ampere in integer computation. It features a CUDA core that has both an FPU and ALU, with only one being able to perform a calculation for any given clock cycle. Ampere instead clusters FPUs together to share an integer ALU, and comes with the same feature as Pascal, that being either the ALU or FPUs can be active, but not both at the same time. This means when integers are being processed, the number of threads is halved on the newer RTX 3060, whereas all the CUDA cores on the Titan X Pascal can just switch to perform integer math. When running integer-driven or mixed data type workloads, the Titan X Pascal actually has a massive advantage over the 3060 in terms of parallel processing. What makes this all the more interesting is the fact that this card is cheaper than the 3060. Moving into the memory subsystem, and we get 12 10GB per second rated GDDR5X modules on a 384-bit bus. I've overclocked mine to reach 11GB per second, allowing the bandwidth to reach a whopping 528GB per second on the GPU cores for our 12GB of memory. The massive bus width is also what helps this card beat out the similarly spec'd RTX 3060, and its fraternal twin the 1080 Ti. I've got my card modded to use a Kraken G12 with a 120mm AIO attached to the die itself. The cores idle at around 35 Celsius and maxed out at around 60 C when under load. This is beyond manageable, and it's just further proof that Pascal runs relatively cool. A secondary fan is used to cool the memory chips, which all have copper blocks attached to dissipate heat. If you're planning on picking one of these cards up, I'd recommend a mod like this to squeeze every last drop of performance from the thing, as it's relatively cheap in the grand scheme of things. Because of this though, I'm able to hit over 2 GHz when playing games, giving us a total of over 14 teraflops of raw FP32 and Int32 compute. Even though teraflop numbers can't really be directly compared, this GPU offers significantly more performance than any of the available consoles, and absolutely shreds through games at lower resolutions. Let's get back to the GPU itself though, and see what else it's capable of. Unfortunately, if you're looking for DLSS and ray tracing, this card can't run the former and can run the latter very slowly. This card just doesn't have the fixed function circuits such as tensor and RT cores, so this card is basically just a giant bank of ALUs and FPUs without any of the fancy stuff. That should theoretically drop the price of this card once the crypto bubble pops, but until then the 32 megahash per second of this card makes it kind of profitable for mining. Hopefully Intel's upcoming ZSS will be able to run on straight FP32 cores, but for the time being AI image reconstruction and scaling is off the table. Texture mapping units and ROPs number 224 and 96 respectively, hinting at a rasterization and texture engine that's beyond capable of 4K rendering. In fact, most of the games from the prior generation of consoles run at 4K at medium to high settings quite well, but we'll get to that later down the line. For now, just be aware that it's a very capable setup, and should allow the card to power higher resolutions. For more proof of this, look no further than the pixel and texture fill rate. With over 162 gigapixels per second and just under 379 gigatexels per second of total fill rate, this card is able to heavily parallelize texturing geometry, and with a large bank of shader cores, the onboard chip can process and shade thousands of pixels at a time, and when combined with the previously mentioned 2 GHz core clock, it can chew through data quicker than most CPUs. Power consumption for my particular card maxes out around 200 watts, which compared to the newer Ampere cards is very competitive. This means it's able to fit within a 650 watt power budget easily when paired with a high-end CPU. So I'd recommend at least a 650 watt PSU to get your system up and running, and more if you plan on upgrading later down the line. All of this though translates to a 6+8 pin PCIe power connection, and since this is the only flavor available, you won't have other models that could potentially draw more power through larger PCIe power connectors. It's kind of unfortunate, but once again this card draws around 200 watts when overclocked, which isn't as much as current generation Ampere based cards. What do these specs translate to though? Firstly, and probably most importantly, the card is compatible with DirectX 12, Vulkan, and OpenGL 4.6, all of which are used extensively on modern graphics software. It also supports CUDA, which for you programmers out there could allow you to attain higher performance through parallelization of your code. I've personally dabbled my feet in CUDA programming, and although the learning curve is kinda steep, it all becomes incredibly rewarding when your first program compiles successfully. It might be worth experimenting with. Even though the specs sound impressive, how do they translate into real-world performance? Well, to find out, let's throw the card in my test system, an i7-11700K based machine with 64 gigs of 3200 megatransfers per second DDR4. This should help to eliminate the CPU as a potential bottleneck and keep our card fed with all the data it could possibly process. To avoid a single-threaded bottleneck, I've clocked all cores to a locked 5 GHz, and even though the temperatures can get a bit toasty, it never got uncomfortably warm under my 360mm AIO. All games will be run off my Samsung 860 QVO and Crucial P2 1TB drives, to ensure that storage speed doesn't impact the performance of our games. I think it's also important to mention that we'll be testing our games at medium settings across the board, with textures set to their highest values. This helps to not only preserve material quality, it also takes advantage of our massive frame buffer, while not stressing the GPU out too hard for effects or shaders that affect the visuals minimally. It ultimately allows our games to look better than the lowest settings while not wasting compute time on unnecessary features. Enough of the specs though, let's go to the performance. Let's start off with a game that's not well known for being well optimized. Ark Survival Evolved actually ran better than I was initially expecting. If you have a 4K 60Hz screen, then this card for Ark would allow for you to get a nearly locked 60 FPS experience. 1440p would allow for high refresh rate gaming, with the minimum coming in at 127 FPS, and 1080p offering frankly crazy amounts of performance. We're probably running into a single-threaded bottleneck on our 11700K, which explains the smaller gap between 1440 and 1080p, but it's hard to complain about 95 FPS at 4K and 172 at 1440p. Battlefield 2042, another game that generally runs poorly on anything but modern hardware, rendered an average of 47 FPS at 4K. The frame grouping oddly gets looser as we lower the resolution, hinting that there's more fluctuation on this card as we drop below 1440p. 1080p though, while providing the best performance, doesn't perform as well as Ark, and certainly not as well as Call of Duty Warzone. The game at 4K though was glorious, and I could see every detail on my character and in the environments. It's just something you have to see for yourself. For me though, I prefer higher frame rates over higher resolutions, and even so 1440p offers performance that I'd be happy with. Call of Duty Vanguard, the latest from the COD franchise, actually ran similarly to Battlefield 2042, with 4K performance looking kind of poor. However, it jumped down to 1440p and our frame rates improved significantly, with 1080p allowing for a locked higher refresh rate setup. Lowering the settings even further would allow you to get a nearly locked 120Hz experience, which would help the game feel smoother. If you're eyeing a Titan X Pascal to get into some COD, then you'll get some pretty decent performance at resolutions lower than 4K. Also, I think it's important to mention that the game has a dynamic resolution feature as well as FSR support. I personally think the game looks great when set to the quality setting and helps us to claw back some performance at 4K. CSGO, an incredibly popular Source Engine based game, ran into a CPU bottleneck at resolutions below 4K. I chose this game also because it runs very similarly to other esport titles such as Apex Legends. This game doesn't have a 144 FPS cap though, meaning we can actually see some of the differences since the frame rates are so high. The minimum and maximum are identical between 1080p and 4K, but the average being around 40 FPS lower when rendering at the latter. This indicates that while the performance can be limited by the CPU at times, the GPU is more of a player in frame rates once we make the jump to 4K. No matter the resolution, the game remained beyond playable, and I'd happily slay some noobs all day using this setup. Our next unoptimized game is Cyberpunk 2077. Interestingly, when benchmarking this title, I noticed that the game actually felt smooth even when the frame rates were below 60 FPS. 4K performance was frankly poor, but lowering the resolution to 1440p improved the average by a whopping 21 FPS. 1080p performance was more than playable, but for this card being a Titan, it's kinda disappointing that we're only hitting 80 FPS on average. I'd like to think though that it's more of the game's fault and less of the card's fault, especially given the performance up to this point has been so high. Doom Eternal, an incredibly well optimized and designed game, hit 91 FPS average at 4K. At 1440p and 1080p, we actually ran into a CPU bottleneck, so if you're looking to experience the demon slaying that Doom has to offer, I'd recommend throwing on the dynamic resolution feature and playing at 4K. However, keep in mind that the medium settings in this game are equivalent to most other games' high settings, so the graphics on display here are beyond amazing. I'd highly recommend checking this game out if you're looking at this particular card, as its performance and graphical effects are beyond impressive. Grand Theft Auto V, a game built on Rockstar's Rage engine, offered incredible performance at all resolutions. I think though that something's up with the minimum at 4K. I didn't use the benchmarking feature and instead just played the game to get realistic ideas of performance, but this could be why the data looked a little skewed. At the end of the day though, this is a 9-year-old game and it performs excellently at all the resolutions. A new game to our test suite, Halo Infinite performed well, but below expectations given the quality settings. At 4K, the Titan X Pascal returned an average of 51 FPS, which while remaining playable isn't where I personally prefer my games. To achieve a locked 60 FPS, all I had to do was lower the internal resolution scaling down to around 80%, which then performed excellently. I have to say that I've been having fun with this game lately, and I can't wait to dig into it further on this particular card after this review goes live. Overwatch, a game that could run on a potato, showed beyond impressive performance at all resolutions tested. This game though is probably single-threaded bottleneck at 1080p, so in all honesty you should probably raise the graphics settings and just enjoy the aesthetics. Your frame rate won't suffer, so it's a free bit of extra graphical effects, and the game looks great at medium settings though, and I'd happily play all day at 4K on this card. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, an Unreal Engine 4 title, performed excellently on the card no matter the resolution. Thankfully though, the PC platform lets you customize your experience, so if you want to be able to see distant players, then turn the resolution up to 4K and have at it. Conversely, if you want all them frames, then 1080p offers you a hyper-competitive 182 FPS average. The customizability of the platform is incredible, and I'm sure in this current GPU shortage, this sort of performance is mouth-watering. For our next game, Rainbow Six Siege, I used the benchmarking feature to gauge how well the game performed. Based on the results, the game is beyond playable at all resolutions, and would allow for high refresh 4K gaming when those monitors become available. One thing I did notice though is the lower the resolution, the more we depend on the CPU, and we see the gap between the minimum and maximum open up more. Either way, we're talking over 300 FPS on average at 1080p, so it's kind of hard to complain about performance when it's this crazy high. Red Dead Redemption 2, another game built on Rockstar's Rage engine, performed adequately at 4K, but significantly better at 1440p. 1080p performance was beyond high refresh rate playable, and I'd recommend just checking the game out on this card at 1080p. Something about this game just feels so much better at 100 FPS plus. But to be honest, you don't lose that much performance at 1440p. It seems to me that 1440p is the sweet spot with this particular game, as the performance is there and the visuals look more crisp. Our final game, Call of Duty Warzone, ran at over 60 FPS at a full fat 4K, and was beyond playable at all resolutions tested. Even though I'd prefer to have over 71 FPS on average at 4K, especially given this is a competitive game, it wasn't necessary to be enjoyable. Sure, higher frame rates make everything better, but at 4K I can see so many details that it's kind of amazing. I really do enjoy this game at 4K, and if you're picking one of these cards up to play this game, you'll have a beyond enjoyable experience. Alright, now that we've discussed the benchmarks, let's discuss where it falls in the overall lineup of GPUs. Surprisingly, if you're looking up other benchmarks for the RTX 3060 online, you'll see that its 4K performance falls roughly in line with the Titan X Pascal. However, given the beefier specs of the Titan's memory system combined with Pascal's architectural advantage with integer math, makes the Titan a stronger choice in my personal opinion. You get 12 gigs of memory with the Titan, so you aren't losing any capacity either, and the overall build quality is very high end. It just looks and feels premium, which is something that I really appreciate in these Founders Edition cards. However, the larger lithographic node combined with the overall age of Pascal means that the card isn't technically as efficient as the RTX 3060. But all the performance minus the ray tracing is there and makes this particular card one of my favorites. It's just cool to say I have a Titan, and actually still have tons of power under the hood for tasks such as video editing. I didn't really go into production workflows as I instead chose to focus more on gaming performance. But from my experience, this card accelerates video editing in DaVinci Resolve excellently. This helps to take some load off our CPU, but more importantly allows filters and pixel shaders to be run in parallel. If I did something like a green screen and added a filter over it, I can use this GPU to speed up the render times, and in my experience it's worked perfectly and quickly for everything I use it for. For editing videos and thumbnails, this thing is a beast and shreds through timelines with ease. Now for the pricing. If you can find a Titan X Pascal for less than an RTX 3060, then go with the Titan all day. If you're able to find it for the same price as the 3060, then I'd still go with the Titan. It's just got much more going for it on the memory side of things. And yes, even though it's old GDDR5X, it still performs phenomenally and actually provides more memory bandwidth than the 3060. So if you're eyeing one of these cards or waiting to snatch one up, then I would personally not buy one for more than the price of a 3060. I say that though because we're still in the middle of a crypto boom, and I know the GPU prices are going to bottom out sometime in the near future. I don't want to tell you guys to buy one for $700 or $800. To be honest, I don't know exactly how much they're going for today, when you could be watching this video months from now and just want to see how one of these older and cheaper Titan cards performs. It's actually surprising how cheap these cards stayed during the whole crypto debacle as well. I bought mine in the middle of it for significantly less than an RTX 3060, and I got a similarly powerful GPU core and a much more capable memory system for the price I paid. Keep an eye out because as GPU prices come down, so will the price of this card, leaving it open to inclusion in future budget systems. For now though, the card presents itself as a very competent and competitive graphics processing unit. Even though the prices are a bit high, the performance is more than there for a competitive 1440p and 4K card, especially for titles that are from the last generation. It's incredible how well Pascal is aged, and this GP102 die shows the architecture in near full force. The 1080 Ti can be had for less than the Titan X Pascal, but you're losing 1 gig of memory and getting a slightly slimmer memory bus. The Titan X Pascal is an awesome alternative to the 1080 Ti, and I can't wait for more of you to experience it.